Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative questions of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. My name is Alex Clare-Young, and I am JPIT's Campaigns and Church Engagement Officer. Today's guest is Joe Clare-Young. Welcome. Joe is a minister ordained in the URC tradition, a member of the Iona Community, who currently spends her days navigating around Norfolk, Suffolk, Cambridgeshire, Essex, and a tiny bit of Hertfordshire, serving the 105 churches of the URC's Eastern Synod, providing training and resourcing for mission. She also wanted me to let you folks know that she has a chihuahua who may appear in the recording, and she also happens to be my wife, so let's hope that this goes okay. Joining us today from JPIT is Paul Morrison. Hi, Paul.
Hello.
Paul has just told me a bit about the first time that he preached on Trinity Sunday, so we may get to that a little bit later in the episode too. But first to Joe, when you're going around training churches and speaking with them about mission, does politics come up? What do you kind of talk to them about whether politics belongs in the pulpit?
It came up a lot of the year of the election. The debate about hustings came up, churches hosting hustings, and whether we should do politics at all as church. To which I'd always say, well, everything we do is politics. Absolutely everything we do. If they're going to start a food bank, that's political. Everything we do is politics. And I think it's good when churches host hustings and when the two kind of blend and merge ever so slightly, and it becomes a safe space to talk about some of the things we need to talk about.
Thank you. Absolutely. So as we record, the top headline that is coming up is around the USA's new travel bans. Trump has banned the citizens of 12 countries from entering the USA. In the UK, in better news, Keir Starmer describes the expansion of free school meals as a down payment on child poverty. And finally, in less good news, from my perspective at least, Kemi Badenoch has launched a review into leaving the European Court of Human Rights. So, lots to talk about this week. We are recording ahead of Sunday, the 15th of June, which will be Trinity Sunday. And the readings are from Proverbs 8, talking about the gifts of wisdom and wisdom's part in creation. Romans chapter 5, talking about justification. And John 16, where the work of the Spirit is introduced. In terms of awareness days, Sunday, June the 15th comes at the end of Fair Tax Week and Great Big Green Week, and just before Learning Disability Week and Refugee Week, which both start on the 15th. The blogs which introduce the context around JPIT's climate campaign will begin to appear on Monday, the 9th of June, so please do keep an eye out on our social media for more climate justice content throughout the rest of June and early July. It's also the Sunday after the comprehensive spending review, so please do keep your eye out to that. And in particular, it might be worth having a look at that and thinking about how that links with some of the themes of fair tax, which you may have explored in the week previous. So bearing all of that in mind, let's start to have a look at these texts. Joe, is there a particular passage you would choose to preach from, a theme across the lectionary texts, or where would you start?
Well, let's start with the elephant in the room. It's Trinity Sunday, the one that has some of us screaming and hiding, and we're all worried that we might say something that's a little bit Arian or a touch heretical, or even worse, we could just be completely incomprehensible as we try and explain the Trinity. So I wouldn't start there. In fact, I think these are actually really nice texts if we stop trying to cram them into, stop trying to squint at wisdom and see her as a person of the Trinity. If we just take these texts as they are, I think that's a good place to start. And I think there's a little kind of journey through them that I can see. That's something about listening and paying attention and speaking, because we've got Proverbs at the crossroads, shouting, wanting to be heard. And then we've got John starting with that line, and you've just read the headlines out to us, right? And you could have picked 100 more headlines that would have been really bad. And it starts with that, I have many things to say to you, but you can't bear them now. And I know I'm twisting and taking out of context, but that's kind of how I feel with the news. There's so many other things that could be said right now, but I can't bear them. Wisdom's told us to listen, right? And we can't because it's overwhelming. And then we get that whole bit about actually the Spirit's there to join us in that work, to help us listen and to speak out. And I think there's a whole kind of arc in there about listen, whose voices aren't being heard, who do we need to listen to, whose voices can we raise up? How is the Spirit a partner in this work for us? And then Romans just coming in at the end with that little kick of peace and hope for everyone.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Would you start with one of the readings or with the Trinity, Paul, or do you have a good reason not to start with the Trinity?
Well, I'm Irish, so I'd probably do my children's address with a shamrock just for old time's sake. And I'm sure I would probably one of when my wife was training for the ministry at Wesley House, the head of the college said that they when he was training, they were asked to do a children's address about the Trinity, and they could use any illustration they wanted, and they had to minimize the heresies, and they'd only managed, and really only one or two heresies was considered, par to quite good, because it was really complicated. So I think when I read them originally, I was really struggling. And then I started reading a couple of uh, the sort of expositions of the Proverbs. And I thought the playing with the idea of wisdom was really interesting. I thought the idea of wisdom as some sort of as wisdom and justice and morality as underpinning the creation of our universe. That felt like if you wanted to talk about justice issues, the beauty of the creation that is being discussed has to have justice woven into it. And that felt like a way of bringing in those things around tax justice and bringing in those things about the world being unjust as we see around us, and how we bring that beauty back and how God wants us to be part of bringing that beauty back.
What do you think, Joe, when you were thinking about Proverbs? Were those the sort of lines that you were going down when you were thinking of those voices being heard at the crossroads?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely obviously a lot about creation in there, and I love that bit at the end about playing in God's inhabited world, delighting in the human race, because that's the whole human race in all its messy variety. So you've got quite a strong inclusion kind of message coming into that as well. Um, and yeah, wisdom standing up and raising her voice makes wisdom very real, very verby. Wisdom is being very politically active and challenging us quite a lot this week, I think. We don't get Lady Folly in this part of Proverbs, but I think we see Lady Folly in our headlines, so it's good to have Lady Wisdom here as well.
Absolutely. That wisdom speaking into social justice as part of speaking into environmental justice and kind of coming before creation and delight that you were talking about, kind of linking the delight and play to that, has made me think about one of the environment blogs that we're about to have coming out, where I've drawn a bit as well on that bit of Isaiah, where the mountains and the trees are clapping and singing and leading us forth in joy and peace.
Mm.
And I wonder if I actually might end up pulling that in here, because there is this sense in this reading, isn't there, that wisdom is both before and within creation, and that leads to delight, and that creation of delight is for everyone and everything. And if it's going to be for everyone and everything, then that requires a call to justice.
And we definitely, I mean, we know we need to be listening to those worst affected by the climate crisis. We know we need to be listening to the wisdom from the oppressed and the marginalized and the earth itself. But just because we know it doesn't mean we're particularly good at doing it. We tend to start to look for our wisdom from those in academia, and not looking for our wisdom from those with the lived experience. And we really need to flip that. And I think wisdom's calling us to do that.
Absolutely. Thank you. So going through from that to the things that we cannot bear. So I picked that bit out too, where John says, I still have so many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. Sorry, Jesus says that, witnessed by John. So were you thinking particularly in terms of, that there are difficult things going on in the world and it's too much?
Yeah, that's what it immediately brought to mind. It was so nice to hear the free school meals news. I mean, right now I will take the water skiing elephant as being good news, because as soon as I hear what Mr. Trump has said now, or yeah, what's happening in various countries around the world, it does feel overwhelming. It does feel like I can't take one more bit of bad news. Um, and that's why the John reading's good. It's this: the Spirit will guide you in truth, and that makes truth something that's dynamic and unfolding and still there.
Yeah, I think that kind of dynamic and unfolding nature was something that I picked up on. So I was thinking about how it kind of implies that God will continue to speak into human situations.
And we
Um,
need that, because it's like an overload, isn't it? It's culture war, burnout. It's just so constant. We need some hope, and we need some good news. We need something speaking into the situation.
what do you think, Paul?
Suppose I recognize this, that there is lots that we cannot bear. And that is to do with justice and news. And actually, there will be people in every congregation going through things that feel like they just cannot bear it. And that's part of the human experience. It always has been. And, we're meant to be there and there with people, and the church is meant to be there with people as they're doing it. But I also want to, I feel led to say that actually there's lots of good out there, and it doesn't make the news because it doesn't meet the criteria for a news editor. But and yes, the free school meals thing is, and that's great news. But I worked with Trust for a long time, and every time I went to one of their food banks, you saw good news. You saw the wisdom and the beauty that God has woven within our creation that talked about in Proverbs. You saw it there. You saw it in the cup of tea that was being had. You saw it in the fact that, they knew someone, and they can't get their food in this way, and we'll put it in this way, and we'll put it over here like this, and we'll chat to them like that. They've understood, and they've formed a relationship, and they're working out together how to do things well and create sort of respect. And you see that all over the place. And yes, there are things we cannot bear, and we have to recognize that. But also, it's important to say that that wisdom and that beauty is still there. It's not far under the surface, and it's not getting into our headlines, but it's still there, and we should still rejoice in it. And yeah, absolutely, let's try change the headlines. But at the same time, let's draw strength from the fact that actually in our churches and in our communities, there's beautiful things happening that we should appreciate.
Absolutely. Is there good news in terms of justice, Joe, that you see in your work with local churches that you might bring in?
Absolutely. Churches are doing all sorts of small things, and those small things all add up to an avalanche, hopefully. Um, but as Paul said, it doesn't make the news. It doesn't make the news. We've got this idea of the Spirit guiding us in truth. When the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all truth, but he will not speak his own, but he will speak whatever he hears. If we don't pass on what the Spirit makes known to us, if we can't pass on those little nuggets of joy and grace that we see bursting through in our churches, in our everyday life, then there's something wrong. We need a way to do that, and it's not good news stories on a church's website. That those little glimpses of God's grace, we need to find our way to share them, to speak what we hear.
So I just wanted to add to that. Often we say the good news is we've given out food.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's okay. I'm not against giving out food, working food banks. But for me, the good news is in those relationships. For me, the good news is the dignity. For me, the good news is in the support and the recognizing of the person, people created in God's image, that happens both ways. That is both given and received. And that's where the life feels like it comes from. So rather than talking about good news in terms of service done to, talk about the good news in terms of relationships built and grown and explored.
And what we've learned from each other. I mean, as both of you were speaking, I was thinking about this balance of good news and bad news, which is actually one of the questions that we always send to guests ahead of Politics in the Pulpit, but rarely actually get to as an actual question is, where's the good news? Where's the bad news? And I think one of the things that I'm hearing and what you're both saying is that the good news and the bad news is actually within our congregation. It's not always other people out there. And I think that's something we have to balance carefully when we talk about politics in the pulpit, that we can often talk about it as if we're the people who are okay and we need to help those people out there. Actually, no, there are people struggling with all sorts of things in our congregations with all sorts of lived experiences. Um, and there are people with all sorts of lived experiences who are part of the things that we're running, like food banks and so on. Um, and seeing them as the us and as the people we can learn from and as the people we can meet God through, I think is really kind of central. And maybe they are the hands of Jesus now, or the mouths of Jesus now, saying the many things to us that we couldn't bear Jesus saying to us. I don't know.
Some extent, you're almost moving us on to Romans, to that kind of framework of hope and resilience that we find in there. That this kind of deep peace, this deeply needed peace that's really absent in culture wars and absent in much of our news and political life. That call to be peacemakers, and that reminder that when things get really, really messy, we need God there to help us to make peace. And I think the current climate does count as really messy, but we need God there as well, just to help us in the everyday bits, to bring out that hope that we're seeing, hope that doesn't put us to shame, because God's love's been poured into our hearts through that Spirit.
Absolutely. And to me, that links back to what we were talking about in terms of the last reading, that hope does not put us to shame, because it kind of links hope and social action and social justice in my mind. And we were talking a bit about, the link between, well, is it that there are food banks that matters, or is it that relationships are built through those that maybe will lead to speaking truth to power? Um, and I guess to me in the Romans, we kind of see this sense that hope doesn't put us to shame because we're given this love. And surely for me, the hope is not just the love's there and that's very nice. It's the love's there and therefore we're going to be called to do things and say things.
I find one of the verses in it really quite, verse 3, I'm reading from the NIV translation, it's just the one I tend to use. Notice, but we will also glory in our sufferings because we know our suffering produces perseverance. And I would imagine read boldly like that, that's quite hard for people to hear. It can be quite guilt-inducing because somebody who feels they're suffering and doesn't really glory in it, they want it gone. So I think that's a verse I would treat with care. I wouldn't use without saying that no, you're not. You don't have to sit and go, thank goodness that the DWP have sanctioned me this week. I am glorying in this, or that I've had an illness, I am glorying in this. I don't think that's what it's saying, but a bold reading could put you there. So I agree with what you've said around that, but for me, there was a big red flashing light there. And that would be the
Yeah.
only thing I'd hear if it was read in church for myself. And I don't know about that. May just be me.
It's not just you. I had it in my notes as well. I'd written that I felt like it actually risked justifying injustice. Kind of saying, oh well, it's good for people. It'll toughen them up.
Mm.
It's great to
Yeah.
experience all these terrible things, and I suspect that we're all people who know that that's just not true.
Yeah.
Um, what do you
And
think,
for
Joe?
mental health as well, sort of, but it's so often with mental health that it's a suck it up. You're gonna get stronger through this. This is gonna make you stronger. Um, and yeah.
Yeah, and I think I'd also just point to the fact that one of the awareness weeks that I pointed out at the beginning is Learning Disability
Mm.
Week, and I'd want to be really clear that that's one of those places in which we can, I don't know, use people with learning disabilities or who are neurodiverse or neurodivergent um, in a way that kind of we're using them for inspiration. That I think also links into this reading. If we um, see things that people might experience in all sorts of nuanced ways as just being part of the cross they have to bear or something like that. That would be really unhelpful.
We did some time ago now, and I think we're just about to repeat it, research on what stories do people tell about poverty and which ones are helpful and which ones are unhelpful. And we, the Striver Skyver one, which was most prominent 15 years ago. But one of the other unhelpful ones was that poverty is good for you, it builds character. And that's
Mm.
something people say about it and use it as a justification. And we don't want to suggest that that is the case. And we don't want to leave that hanging because it's straightforwardly not true. There's quite a lot of evidence in the other direction, frankly.
Mm.
Mm. Um, Joe, you mentioned right back at the start that listening would be um, something that you'd kind of pull out as a link between these readings. Is there something there about how you might bring listening to lived experience into your preaching this week?
Yeah, and I'm listening to Paul speaking then and thinking sort of, where's the help in the readings with that particular issue about how we listen, and what stories are told. Particularly now, sorry, Chihuahua in the way. Particularly now in the era of kind of media manipulation and anti-science sentiment and culture war, and I think we're back with our John reading, and the Spirit will guide you in all truth. And I think that is still true for today. Um, that truth is still dynamic, it's still happening. We're still using the Spirit to listen to what's true. And I think when we hear some of these stories about how those on PIP can get a £40,000 or £140,000 Mercedes for 27p a week, we know um, we know that's not true. But how do we kind of give that lens to more people to experience the truth? Um, and I think it's a bit like, what's the phrase about eating an elephant? It's one bite at a time.
Yeah.
But we've got a job to do. We've got to pass on what the Spirit's telling us. So if we hear that and we know it's wrong, we can't just go, well, that's wrong, isn't it? We've got to talk about it. As those of us that have got a platform have got to say that that's wrong. Um, whether it's the wrongness of a political move or some rhetoric or the oppression of the latest group deemed wrong by a billionaire influencer, we've got to be able to say, but that's not what God wants. God loves everyone.
Amen. I am also wondering if to do that well, one might need to have a nuanced conversation about what truth means, because it's such a complex thing that there's so much disagreement on now, actually talking about truth. And, you know, what is biblical truth is one starting point for that. But I'm actually thinking about, you know, statistics and charts and things, which I know Paul loves, and actually I do as well to a large extent, but how we hold that together with lived experience, together with fake news and untruths. Do you have any thoughts, Paul, on how we might talk about truth helpfully?
I think I when I'm talking about it, I often just mention the fact that there are four gospels. There are four perspectives on on the truth that is Jesus. They sometimes don't quite match because that's what perspectives written by humans. That's what humans do. They have different recollections, they have different viewpoints. And shouting liar at each other when you have slightly different viewpoints is really unhelpful and also unfair. And one of the reasons you tend to focus on numbers is they're clearly defined. So you can say what is true and what is not, but also numbers don't get you. And that's important. But numbers don't get you to the to the human truth of a situation. That has to be got through relationship and dialogue and nuance, which is something the church should be good at, often has been very good at, and has often led the way at. So for me, when I saw, I also have highlighted the word truth. I was what I'm not sure I would preach about that in a sermon myself, other than sort of to say the sorts of things you've said there, but in a more discursive, in a as a Bible study, as a group. And I know lots of churches have a discussion rather than a stand-up sermon. That feels a really rich area, and I'm absolutely confident you will find views in your church you didn't think were there that you'll want to explore and learn from. If you have that, if I have a discussion about what do we mean by truth in the world. Okay, anyway, I'll leave it there.
Oh, that's really helpful, and just a really simple activity that gets people moving around. If you want one in terms of difference in perspective, is simply to have a massive six, or is it nine, somewhere on the floor, and get people around different sides of it and ask them what it says. It's just a really simple, quick, easy illustration of truth. And something that some children and young people find catching adults out on absolutely hilarious. Um, so that might be one way to bring in that conversation. Now, I'm about to make us talk about the Trinity a little bit because some folks might want to preach on the Trinity this week. But is there anything else that either of you would want to say about those readings and your perspectives on those before I take us briefly to the Trinity?
I think it's worth thinking about how we deal with some of the big topics we've been talking about with an intergenerational inclusive church. You know, not just with children, but with those that might struggle to understand some of the concepts behind it. But you know, particularly children, younger children, and the image that keeps coming to mind, shows my age now, is big ears from Noddy, and listening, and making something for children to explain, or for all of us really, to explain and remind us the importance of listening, because we all do it. We're all half listening and half planning what we're going to say next, especially when you're being recorded on Zoom. But you know, we're all thinking about what are we going to say next. And yeah, there's a really obvious craft there. I'm glad I didn't think of it earlier, or else I would have made some and been the first person with giant paper ears on politics in the pulpit. But yeah, I think it's just really worth thinking with these how we're going to bring them to children.
Absolutely, thank you. And that brings me on quite nicely to the Trinity, because I did think a bit about Trinity Sunday, partly because I guess part of my job as host is to talk about the things you might not want to talk about as much. And in terms of Trinity Sunday, I was really thinking about the way in which it points us to the social reality that we live in as people who are made in the image of God, and that kind of relationality within God's self. And I'm sure that both Paul and Joe could point out to me all of the heresies that I'm stepping into by going in that direction with it. Um, but that's kind of where I thought I might start. And I was thinking Joe will roll her eyes because this is one of my favorite theology books. But I was thinking about a book called The Call to Personhood by Alistair McFadden, and it's a theology of social relatedness, and McFadden talks about that we image God on these two axes, that there's the vertical one, which he uses to describe our dialogue with God, and the horizontal one that he uses to describe our dialogue with other people. We could go off on a tangent about whether vertical and horizontal are helpful ways to think about that, but he talks about dialogue and what dialogue actually means and what dialogue would have to look like to image God. And he talks about dialogue as being about going into a conversation with the intent to be changed rather than with the intent to change the other. And he feels that if you go into conversation with the intent to change the other, then that is monological and doesn't image God. And if you go in with the intent to be changed, that is dialogical and does image God. And that's how he posits that we can move beyond kind of binary disagreements like culture war thinking. And so I was just thinking about how does that kind of social aspect of God as Trinity fit into how we talk about politics in the pulpit? Is there a politic within God's self that we might want to refer to? But I wonder if either of you have any reflections on that or any ways into the Trinity that you might suggest.
From my perspective, one of the most, I kind of have two images that I fall back on when I'm talking about justice. The one is created in God's image, and that we're all created in God's image, which kind of starts to be foundational to that how we should treat people, sort of with equity and as if they are precious, because they are. And the other one is that God is in a relationship. He is created as a relationship almost between those three. And within almost all of the sort of structures that we rail against in JPIT around, be it benefit systems, be it economic structures where people are oppressed and people get the bad end of the stick because of the power dynamics. In almost all of them, human relationships are being stripped out. And so when I would talk about Trinity, and I'm not sure I'd use this is that helpful, but it is about relationship and how bringing relationship into social structure, into economic structures, humanizes them and makes them more just. And I think the example I give a lot is if you look at your phone. When I worked with a company called Fairphone, they tried to source the raw materials as fairly as possible, but they could not guarantee, even with their best efforts, that their tantalum used in the screens didn't come from child labor in Congo, because a large amount of that particular metal comes from there. And if I had a relationship with that child, I wouldn't touch that phone. If I knew that person, if I could see them, it would be appalling to me. Whereas, because there's 15 economic transactions between that child and me, that metal has been sold several times. The relationship's been stripped away, and I can use the phone. And to me, the Trinity is about maintaining those relationships and about keeping human relationships. Sorry, I've gone on too long. I apologize.
No.
Absolutely not. What do you think, Joe?
I really struggle with the Trinity. One of the creeds that we commonly use is we worship one God in Trinity, the Trinity in unity, neither blending their persons nor dividing their essence. And I wonder what it would mean, what it would be like to treat society like that, neither blending their persons nor dividing their essence. So we're not trying to see everyone as being one unique organism. We are part of a community, and that's really important. That community word is really important. So we're not trying to be individualistic, but at the same time we don't want to divide the essence of. I don't know quite where I'm going with that, but something in that speaks to me about community, neither blending their persons nor dividing their essence. And I'm going to leave it at that because, yeah, I struggle with the Trinity.
No, I think that's really helpful. That's taken me to a phrase I often use, which is unity and diversity, which is about that kind of being able to hear different voices that we've been speaking about throughout. Because for me, I mean, if I was speaking about the Trinity, I'd start with saying that I very much believe that the Trinity is primarily used as a pedagogical method. It's a way that we teach people about aspects of God. It doesn't limit God to threeness in a particular way in my theological understanding of it. And I know that that's a niche theological understanding that not everyone would share. But bearing that in mind, for me, one of the things the Trinity demonstrates is that a person or people can have distinctive characteristics and still be part of a whole body or community that is different and that contains those diverse characteristics. If God can contain diversity within God's self, then we can within ourselves. And if you lose that particularity of each individual, then you can't form those dialogical relationships that Paul was pointing to as being really important. If you don't know who that child is, then there's no relationship to have. So I often think that the way in which individualism is called out as distinctive from being based in community can be oversimplistic or unhelpful, because actually people do have identities, and that, that's a part of how we talk about forming relationships and community, I guess.
Thank you for making sense of what I was trying to say.
So thank you, Joe. Thank you, Paul. And thank you all for listening. And I hope this episode helps you in your preaching prep. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts and share this episode with your friends. We also have online spaces for further engagement and discussion around faith and politics on our social media platforms. I'm going to leave you with a prayer based on the start of that Proverbs reading about wisdom. So let's pray. Does not wisdom call, and understanding raise her voice? God, help us to know when to call out for justice, when to raise our voices against oppression and the use of people as if they were economic objects. On the heights beside the way, at the crossroads, she takes her stand. God, help us to know when we're at the crossroads, to look back and reflect and let go of the things that were wrong, to look at the options ahead of us and seek your way of justice. Beside the gates, in front of the town, at the entrance of the portals, she cries out. God, help us to bring the streets and all those who walk, drive, or roll on them in our cities to you in our prayers and in our preaching. To you, O people, I call, and my cry is to all who live. God, help us to hear, to read, to know, and to live your justice as people who love the way of wisdom. Amen.